So, yes, indeed, this is a new talk, and I'm calling them rather awkwardly my talks now live audio essays, so I hope you don't mind me making that stipulation. And the title of this talk would be Contradiction. The word split into its two parts, and then with the subtitle Speech Against Itself. So, for the past years I've been mostly dedicated to understanding the role of voice in law and the changing nature of testimony in the face of new regimes of border control, algorithmic technologies, medical sciences, and methodologies of eavesdropping. Wherever I've probed this question into the politics of listening and the way our voices are resounding throughout the juridical and political system, I always arrive back at a core issue, a fundamental point of tension between the two essential components that constitute speech. And this would be the saying, the object quality of the voice, the act of speech, its sonorous materiality unique to all, and the said, which would be a term that pertains to a system of language common amongst interlocutors. The said is the interpreted meaning derived from the saying, semantic speech for which often voice sound is merely a vehicle, an excess that we quickly filter off in favor of the meaning of the words that have been uttered. Now, within of the juridical and political spaces to which I have been listening over the past years, such as asylum tribunals and interrogation rooms, I keep finding that this battle between the saying and the said is what seems to most profoundly affect the way we represent ourselves and advocate our rights. When one of these voices is privileged over the other, it can radically alter the way we ourselves become constituted as subjects and how we become governed by the long ear of the law. This radical remixing of a person's subjectivity by privileging either the act of speech or the meaning of the words, the saying or the said, perhaps has such profound political resonance because speech, after all, is what makes us political animals. Speech concerns matters of truth. Law establishes the truth through oral discourse. Through a set of audible claims, oaths, objections, and declarations, the law arrives at its verdicts. Verdict, a word which, of course, when split in its two halves, literally means truth, speech. Listening, the means through which we receive these verdicts, and the means through which truth in speech is interpreted, extracted, and judged, is a highly politically sensitive technology. And in my latest exploration of the laws and legal precedents that govern our voices and patrol our ears, amongst the freedoms of speech and the rights to silence, I found a piece of originally Shia Islamic jurisprudence called taqqiya. And taqqiya is now going to be the subject of what I want to talk to you today. So taqqiya, in its simplest possible articulation, it is a legal dispensation whereby a believing individual can deny his faith or commit otherwise illegal acts while they are at the risk of persecution or in a condition of statelessness. So this is how it's written in its kind of form as Islamic jurisprudence. Taqqiya is a very complex theological and juridical concept, which I want to work through in its relation to speech. However, to give a preliminary context, we could see taqqiya as a legal dispensation similar to that of the laws which govern the figure of the informant, a person who can legally commit illegal crimes whilst under the employment of a legal body. So an FBI informant can commit crimes whilst under the employment of the FBI. In much the same way, taqqiya is also a contradictory concoction of being both inside and outside of the law simultaneously. Taqqiya is really now only practiced by the very esoteric minorities of Islam, and for one in particular, the Druze, taqqiya is really at the core of the religious doctrine. So the Druze, for those who don't know, are a community of about 1 million spread across the Levantine countries, so that's Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan, and Israel. And the doctrine is a branch of Ismailism, distinct in its incorporation of Socratic philosophy as part of its reading of the Islamic text. So for the Druze, prayer is typically private, and there is no mosques found in Druze communities. Taqqiya is the concept through which this non-coercive religious activity of the Druze is maintained. Here, the belief that making one's religious thoughts public is a form of sacrilege against the private dialogue that you have with your maker. So here we see how taqqiya is already gaining in complexity. For it's not only a legal dispensation and an act of dissimulation, but a technology of withdrawal from the fundamental obligation to perform oneself in public, to speak on behalf of oneself, to confess one's heart of hearts, withdrawing truth speech from the domain of the public. Excuse me. Oops. So, briefly, and without causing too much attention to itself, the word taqqiya recently emerged in the discourse that surrounded a mainstream news event. And it is this one. In late December of 2013, reports began emerging from Idlib province in northern Syria that the entire population of 18 villages belonging to the Druze had been subject to mass conversions from the Druze doctrine to Wahhabi Islam. Taking responsibility for these conversions was the Islamic militia Jabhat Nusra, who are now loyal to the infamous ISIS. The conversion mission was undertaken by this guy you see here, with the gun. He's called Sheikh Saad Saeed al-Ghamidi, who had traveled specifically from Saudi Arabia. Al-Ghamidi's crusade from Saudi Arabia to Idlib province, Jabal Sumak, to convert the Druze was extensively documented and uploaded. And in the images, we see Al-Ghamidi and his cohorts simultaneously armed with machine guns and humanitarian supplies as they entered the remote villages. We only see still photographs of the Druze going through the conversion process. Their mouths are caught open by the camera lens, but their voices are never heard. In this sense, Al-Ghamidi remains the sole auditor of these conversions. Moreover, in all images relating to these events, we do not see an image referring to any possible resistance to Al-Ghamidi's conversions, and nor do we hear any direct statement from the now converted community. The evidence of the conversion used by Al-Ghamidi that he and Jabhat Nusra circulated widely is a handwritten 4-page Druze author declaration which states that the undersigned 18 villages have converted to Islam and that they now denounce the so-called Druze doctrine. And this is Ghamidi teaching people how to pray, how to sing the call to prayer, the azan, etc. And these are the videos that Al-Ghamidi himself uploaded. So quickly the story becomes popular in the so-called free international press, where we hear the classic narrative of an individual's free will and identity under threat. This narrative is mobilized to serve the all too common and dangerously negligent discussion on Syria of the unmanageable and hopeless complexities of the conflict. A similar narrative that also serves Bashar al-Assad controlled state media, who quickly promote the news of forced conversions of Syrian minorities as a legitimizing agent of a tirade of barrel bombs, torture and murder committed against thousands of lives. Yet there is another more unexpected and hushed claim that starts to be made audible in the discourse that surrounds the event. Here, these villagers are not described as victims of a forced conversion. This claim is that the act here was not the conversion of the Druze to Wahhabi Islam, but in fact an act of taqqiya. What sounded to the ears of Al-Ghamidi exactly like the required speech act of Islamic conversion was in fact the sound of taqqiya. Taqqiya is much like the truth and much like politics in that its medium is speech. Taqqiya is in fact a speech act. Why and how and what forms this speech act takes will be explained to us now by myself in dialogue with a Druze scholar called Wissam Abu Daghram. And please note, for reasons of anonymity, you will hear Wissam's voice disguised. So here is Wissam. Here is Wissam describing taqqiya. In our part of the world, mothers talk to their newborn babies in a language called Ngr Apu. It is a 2-syllable word composed of Ngr Apu. It means nothing. It has no meaning. It is just 2 sounds, Ngr and Apu, used to communicate with the newborn child. The newborn baby perhaps does not understand, does not have any way of processing this information in its brain to really understand any meaning other than just an abstract sound of the mother's voice. So what does the Ngr Apu communicate? What is flowing through these 2 syllables? It is love and care. So the child receives these 2 sounds that don't make any linguistic sense,
but transmit the mother's love. The language will grow with the child as the mother will raise the communication skill to a higher level. When the child has grown older, the mother will say, "Let's go for breakfast." Then, when the child grows older again and goes to school, the mother will say, "Take your sandwich with you." When the child becomes a student in college, there is no way the mother will say to her child, "Ingr apu." So taqqiya is the means of communication that you adapt to any person based on the amount of knowledge that he, she is capable of understanding. You speak to people on the level of the other's readiness to listen.
So through his description of taqqiya as a vocal practice, Wissam reminds us of the fact that voice precedes language, that the saying precedes the said, that the baby listens to pure sound, and that the voice itself, not language, is the essence of communication. And this is important in understanding taqqiya because it's about insisting on the dependency of the said, the system of language, to the saying, the dependency of language to voice, to its formal qualities. A reminder that in any context of speech, the vocal form that speech takes remains significant as a mode of communication in and of itself. And this is what allows one to speak to people on the level of the other's readiness to listen. So taqqiya is the form that speech takes according to your interlocutor. The act of speech, the how to say something, and the who that you are speaking to are all made audible in the way that you perform your speech. And understanding that listening is as much an act that produces speech as speech itself. So inserting the listener into the way you speak to them, judging the conditions of how you are being heard, and speaking accordingly. What they want to hear, what they will not hear, and what they can only hear becomes embedded into the saying, into the act of speech. Now, a Lebanese anthropologist, Fouad Khouri, states that from a very early age, Druze learn how to pronounce correctly all the Arabic phonemes, which is not done, to my knowledge, by any other Arab group from the Gulf to the Atlantic. So this too is another way of insisting on language as a system of rules, but also as a specific formation of sounds. And it is claimed by some that this learning of the correct and true pronunciation of the language is the mechanism that allows taqqiya to be practiced, as truth lies not in what is said, but in the way of saying it. So you can always be pronouncing the truth, while in fact your words are not so faithful to it. So this correct pronunciation that the Druze speak is made audible to most other Levantine Arabic speakers by the articulation of the Arabic letter qaf, a letter most closely aligned with the English Q, but here the sound is pronounced at the very base of the glottis, at the point of the so-called Adam's apple. Hold on. There is the qaf. This is an image made by an Indonesian school to teach the Arabic letters to people who want to learn. So, the qaf sounds like this. Qa, qa, qa. And the Druze have become known for pronouncing this letter, as throughout the Levant, one rarely hears this letter articulated, as it appears in the alphabet. But here's it dropped and pronounced as a, replacing the qa sound with a glottal stop, similar to the British T in the word butter, which is often pronounced butter. So you have butter, butter, taqqiya or taqqiya. Okay? So you have qa and you have a. Now, what Wissam would say about this is something along the lines of, truth means that you have to respect the words. When you respect the truth of the language, you have to pronounce it as it is. To elaborate your pronunciation properly as the language intends also carries with it a level of truthfulness. We pronounce all the Arabic phonemes correctly in order to stick to the basic rules of the language itself. Because if I pronounce the Arabic letter qaf as af, I'm not saying it correctly, so I'm also not speaking the truth. I'm not saying it correctly, so I'm also not speaking the truth. So in this conception that the truth is enmeshed in the phonetic pronouncement of the word, just as much as in the meaning of the word itself, the sound of the word holds as much truth as the word to which it refers. Speaking the truth
is to enunciate the word as it is originally intended in the Arabic language, and the theological context for this is that Arabic language is the divine word of God, unlike English, which is not the original language of the Bible. So, and because the Arabic language is the language of the person who created all things, that means that the Arabic language is not a representation of things in the world, but actually another mode for that thing to exist. The sound of the spoken word in Arabic is therefore inherently onomatopoeic, whereby the form of the thing and its sound are one and the same. In fact, onomatopoeia in English has come to mean words that mimic sound of the thing to which they refer, like crow, bell, wood, drum. But its original meaning is a composite of Greek words that mean making or creating names. The original forging of a sound to an object, a process that is itself at the genesis of all languages, regardless in belief of God or not. So through this conception of language, that truth is not just in the said but inherent to the saying, that truth is neither purely in the saying nor in just what is said, but a collapsing of the two. Truth lies in both hearing word and its sound simultaneously. And if we return to the insistence not to drop the pronunciation of the qaf, to pronounce it properly and not to relegate it to the glottal stop, we have a very literal example. Both words of the Arabic language that refer to truth, haqiqa, and trueness, sidq, both contain the letter qaf. To literally speak the truth, the word, sound and its meaning, one must pronounce the qaf. But sometimes the truth is not what you want to reveal. And pronouncing the qaf would often reveal your true identity as a Druze, as it is mostly only the Druze who pronounce the qaf. And this is not permitted nor encouraged in the practice of taqqiya and the doctrine more broadly. So the problem of speaking with the qaf is that the qaf can speak for itself. It does not speak at the readiness of the other to listen, adapting to their way of hearing. Rather, it imposes itself on the ear of your interlocutor, as it proudly asserts its identity. Pronouncing the qaf in the word taqqiya reveals exactly what the laws of taqqiya forbid you to reveal. Its own pronunciation is a contradiction. To simply utter the word produces a paradox between the saying and the said. And here is where Wissam would also say something like, according to taqqiya, if I'm Druze living in Beirut, which means that you're not surrounded by other Druze, you would pronounce the qaf as af, as a glottal stop. If I'm living in the mountains, which is a Druze stronghold, I should not pronounce it af unless the af would have been accepted there. I should vocalize it qaf. But in general, if I speak af or qaf in any community in order to get attention to my ego, under taqqiya I'm doing something really wrong. So it's a very fine line because speech is really interconnected and entangled with ego. So this is where he refers to something, and in a longer version of the talk I would go into the whole social phenomenon of code switching, where we change how we speak and pronounce things according to who we are speaking to. And in that understanding you would think that taqqiya is never about claiming one identity, never asserting one status, but rather always to be multiple in one's positions. To be both Wahhabi Muslim and Druze at the same moment. To always be both inside and outside of identity and subjecthood, much like the informant who is both inside and outside of the law. So today, as we've heard many people say, we are facing a vast surveillance system, and it's increasingly harder to be outside of its earshot and to evade its gaze. Everything that is spoken now can be heard by not just your interlocutor, but by a vast range of cell phone microphones and algorithmic processes operating in the background. Our speech has entered a new realm of political sensitivity, where we can no longer depend on a place and time to which the law acts on our voices. There is no longer simply the interrogation room, the witness stand, or the soapbox. Speech acts like the oath that transform our words from normal conversation to liable speech are almost redundant. These vast apparatuses of listening, constantly filtering our communication for incriminating keywords, mean that all speech we utter is liable wherever we are. Were I to send a text message with the words gas dispersal to one of you 3 or 4 times, especially that I'm called Abu Hamdan, it is more than likely that after a short time the police would burst in here armed to the teeth. So what's more, this hypersensitive, all-hearing state apparatus gives rise to a reactionary total politics of total transparency, WikiLeaks is the ethical sibling to the NSA. They both believe that the secret is the biggest threat to democracy. In both cases, total transparency and a total system of surveillance, we have the same logic that the only people to be feared and the only people who fear these systems are those who have something to hide. Both claim to a total politics of absolute inclusion where there is nothing that can be outside and anything that is withheld is by virtue a threat, not because of its content, but by its very withholding. So the human right, freedom of speech, has some leverage here. Although it means that you're not accountable for expressing your opinion, it does not stand in contrast or oppose this mentality of the all-speaking, all-hearing society. To speak freely is considered a component of a healthy democracy, and one is constantly encouraged to speak out and to confess one's thoughts publicly. Freedom of speech promotes the society that can have no secrets, a society where everything we say is in the realm of politics. Edward Snowden, a typically taqqiya-like character in his libertarian double-agent collaborator role, reminds us that speech may still be free, but the conditions of listening that we face have certainly changed. It is in the face of algorithmic listening and the receding power of the freedom of speech that other speech practices like taqqiya that allow for an outside and a mode of withdrawal in a time of total politics gain a renewed relevance. And this is where Wissam would say that in the freedom of speech, I'm legally allowed to say anything, to say whatever I want. But when we think about this in relation to taqqiya, it is more like the freedom of speech is the freedom to remain silent. Taqqiya is a means that I'm allowed not to speak. If silence is not part of the freedom of speech, then speech will not be free. If you force me to a talk, you abuse me. And this is what is happening with ISIS in Syria. So Wissam here relates taqqiya to another fundamental legal condition. And that is the right to silence, the legal right against self-incrimination or pleading the Fifth Amendment as it is often referred to in the USA. A similar legal dispensation not to speak the whole truth. Taqqiya as a piece of Islamic jurisprudence could be seen then as a legal precedent to the Fifth Amendment as it emerges something like 1,000 years before. Yet taqqiya is not yet eclipsed by its contemporary because in a few simple ways it remains more robust. Firstly, taqqiya's strength is that it can exist as silence in the guise of speech. Taqqiya does not produce the loud present absence of silence. Taqqiya is silence camouflaged by phonetic articulation. Silence in the guise of speech. In taqqiya, there is no binary division between what one says and what one does not say. There is not one but many silences that permeate across the spectrum of the saying and the said, from the ingir apo to the pledge of Islamic conversion. A whole range of silences can be employed. Secondly, as the right to silence is not a human right and only a right granted to citizens of nations that employ this law, you cannot always be assured that your speech will not be extracted from your body through torture. Therefore, taqqiya becomes especially important in a stateless or precarious legal framework, where one is not afforded the right to silence. Perhaps this is where we hear it emanating from border zones, disputed territories, at lawless altitudes, and on ceasefire lines. Taqqiya is the infra-politics that plays out in the minutiae of human utterance. It is adapted by individuals who inhabit in-between spaces. It is in fact a legal right to inhabit such in-between spaces. The space in between truth and lie, saying and said. Taqqiya is not a minority's claim to an identity or a state of one's own, but rather a claim to statelessness. It is not the right to rule the land, but a command over the border itself, a simultaneously subservient and subversive form of political agency, a contradictory concoction of simultaneously speaking freely and remaining silent. And Wissam may have one last comment. I'll just see. Taqqiya is the truth.
Thank you.